What Confucius can teach you about relationships today. Have you ever wondered why some relationships drain your soul while others make it bloom? We live surrounded by connections, and yet so few of them are real. Instant messages, automatic replies, fragile bonds. And deep down, you feel it. Something is off. A part of you longs for something deeper, for presence, for truth. Maybe it's not affection we're missing, it's integrity. And so, a question arises, one few dare to ask. Is it still possible to build authentic relationships in a world designed for superficiality? The answer begins long before our modern rush. It echoes through the name of a figure who transcends centuries, Confucius. Welcome to Axiom Sage, timeless wisdom from the East to transform your mind and spirit. Imagine him walking silently along a dirt road, stopping in front of a humble family. He doesn't ask how much money they have or how many followers they've gained. He simply asks, how do you treat your own? It's not about manners. It's about essence. It's not about saying respect. It's about what you do when no one is watching. Because it's there, in the absence of an audience, that your ethics reveal who you truly are. But today, the world moves too fast for that. We pass by each other without really seeing. We talk without truly listening. Relationships have become transactions. Likes replaced affection. Convenience took the place of trust. You feel this, don't you? And here's the paradox. The more accessible we've become, the more distant we feel. The more we talk, the less we communicate. And the more we connect, the lonelier we seem to be. Confucius doesn't bring formulas. He brings mirrors. He shows us that the foundation of every relationship doesn't start with the other. It starts with yourself. And that respect, Lee, isn't a gesture, but a state of being. A silent reverence for the dignity of the other. Even when they fail. Even when you'd have every reason to shut down. He reminds us that healthy relationships are not built through unchecked emotion, but through conscious benevolence. Run. The art of recognizing in the other the same spark of humanity that pulses within you. And so you begin to ask yourself, how many of my relationships are real? How many honor me? And how many do I just tolerate? Am I truly connecting or just distracting myself? These are not soft questions. They prod. They unsettle. But maybe that's what you need right now. Not quick answers, but a slow, deep, spiraling journey. Because wisdom doesn't move in a straight line. It flows like the wind through the Tao's bamboo groves, weaving, circling, whispering. It speaks through ancient myths, simple gestures, and silences that say more than words ever could. If something in you feels ready to shift, not just to have better relationships, but to be better within them, then breathe deeply and come with me. Let's walk together through Confucius teachings like one who crosses a mirror. Because true transformation doesn't happen when you change the other. It happens when you begin to live in a way that others change just by observing you. And maybe that's exactly what the world has been waiting for from you. Now, if I were to ask you, what does respect mean in the silence of your everyday life? You might feel a subtle discomfort, because respect isn't just not hurting others. It's recognizing them as part of yourself. Confucius once said, respect even the enemy when he challenges you. That ethical paradox reveals a deeper truth. Unspoken resentment corrodes more than harsh words. Sometimes relationships become fields of invisible warfare, all for lack of reverence. Have you felt that? The absence of emotional honesty in a relationship can be just as toxic as a blatant lie. The contrast between superficial coexistence and real ethical intimacy is a chasm. It reveals that cultivating Li and Run isn't ritual, it's a revolutionary act. In a world addicted to immediacy, A simple gesture of trust becomes a subtle act of resistance. You want quick pleasure, temporary relief, instant connection. But Confucius teaches that false pleasure competes with the soul. He speaks of a restoring harmony that happens when two people honor, respect, and commit, not out of duty, but because virtue resonates. That virtue is circular. Those who live it find it. Those who deny it drift into emotional solitude. So emerges a mythical narrative, not written on scrolls, but alive in silence. Imagine an ancient tree. Its deep roots weather winds, droughts, storms. It survives because it draws from invisible virtues. Its branches offer shade. Its leaves sing in the wind. This tree is a virtuous prince in Confucian thought. It doesn't shout, but it shelters lives. And those who lean on it feel its strength without needing to ask why. Have you ever asked yourself, which of these layers are you living in? Are you building shallow relationships, high branches with no roots, or a solid, ethical presence whose shade nourishes others? That philosophical analogy sparks an invitation. Reflect on whether your relational life today has enough invisible coherence to withstand the storms. Let me ask, what do you fear most in a relationship? Rejection? Vulnerability? Loss of respect? That fear feeds ancient stories, and they repeat themselves in your relationships. That's how the cycle survives. This is where reflective repetition comes in. Every time you avoid vulnerability, you reinforce the pattern of emptiness. Every time you choose conscious presence, you plant a new timeline. You may wonder, but can I really apply this to modern love, to friendships blurred by boundaries, to digital relationships? Yes, because Confucius doesn't teach rigidity. He teaches deep integrity. He doesn't demand perfection. He invites self-honoring and self-awareness. The question that remains is, how can you honor someone today with direct words, without masks, without rushing, and with integrity? Get ready. We're at the beginning of a journey that moves in spirals. Each turn reveals new layers, not at high speed, but in fertile ground. A cycle of questions, silent reflections, subtle transformations. Because the structure of ethical awakening is circular. It always returns to the center. And that center is you. Let's continue. Now, imagine you're present in every conversation. But were you really present? Confucius taught that speaking without awareness is like shooting arrows in the dark. You might hurt or miss entirely. Words without virtue echo empty. But when you feel, think, and act in alignment with Ren and Li, you transform the simple act of speaking into relational creation. Consider the well-known parable of the potter. A potter shapes clay without rushing, gradually adjusting the vessel. If you press too hard, the clay cracks. If you neglect it, it loses form. Likewise, ethical relationships manifest between firmness and flexibility, between integrity and compassion. This analogy reveals a balance Confucius cultivated, neither soulless rigidity nor unsustainable softness. Now let me ask, what kind of vessel are you shaping in your relationships? With those you love, live with, share silence with. If you press too much, you cause fractures. If you leave it too empty, it loses identity. Confucian ethics invite you to find that harmonic center. Do you feel the tension of a relationship that demands too much? Or the coldness of bonds that require nothing at all? Which one dims your light? Every repeated pattern reveals a self-fulfilling cycle. Fear of rejection leads to emotional avoidance. Fear of exposure builds walls. Reflective repetition happens when you think protection is strength, but it's really isolation. So what if I told you, the real risk isn't opening up, but staying stuck in the illusion of who you think you need to be? Here lies the paradox. Hiding out of fear is invisibility, but exposing yourself ethically is courage. Loving with clear boundaries is dignity. Listening with presence is honor. That's how you begin to create relationships that don't drain or settle for emotional scraps, but expand because they generate living soil. Now visualize. You become that virtuous tree from earlier. A solid, welcoming presence. You learn to navigate difficult conversations without platitudes, to set boundaries with compassion, to break old cycles with silent clarity. This is ethical courage, but it's also practice. Circular, reflective, sacred, because every cycle of ethical dialogue echoes through time. It comes back to you with depth. Even when the world demands urgency, you choose to walk with the rhythm of mortal integrity. Slow, organic, consistent. And what if you could live like this today? What if your relationships reflected the inner soil you've been cultivating? What if honor weren't a distant ideal, but the daily pulse guiding your connections? That's the invitation, to realize that the world around you can change. Not because you force it, but because the frequency you emit shifts everything. And when silence becomes more eloquent than any word, you realize ethics isn't a code. It's a presence, sustained even when everything around you collapses. Think of every relationship you live as a mirror, not a perfect reflection, but a living surface, a sensitive field that responds to your emotional frequency with startling precision. Approach it with fear, and it returns tension. With attention, and it offers openness. With responsibility, and it gives you trust. This awareness changes everything. You begin to notice which connections resonate with harmony, which vibrate in constant conflict, and which hide behind silences filled with absence. And then, without accusing, blaming, or losing yourself, you choose. You choose the vessel where your word is poured, the invisible frame that shapes every encounter. You decide whether you'll be a presence that holds or harms, that listens or imposes, that sustains or demands. That's power, a subtle, almost imperceptible power, but deeply transformative, because true growth doesn't happen in grand events, but in the quiet repetition of what's essential. And this may be Confucius' deepest teaching. Repeat virtue until it becomes you. Repeat respect until it flows without effort. Repeat attentive silence until it says everything for you. Like bamboo that bends but doesn't break, your soul learns firm flexibility. And even on days when chaos tries to drag you down, something within you stays. Upright, serene, available. Maybe you feel like you already know all of this, but knowing is not living. Knowing is the seed. Living is watering it every single day. In a conversation you nearly avoided, in the boundary that needed to be set with kindness, in the compliment you could have given but held back. This is relational ethics, turning the ordinary into a ritual of awareness. A gesture, a glance, a pause. Now simply observe. Does respecting the other begin with respecting yourself? Can listening with full presence dissolve judgments your ego clung to? Could your silent ethics be the greatest act of love you've ever offered? Nothing needs to be dramatic. It just needs to be true. And when the root of respect begins to grow within you, quiet, strong, inevitable, something shifts in how you relate to everything. To time, to others, to the world. You realize it's possible to love without losing yourself, to hold space without absorbing, to guide without controlling. And maybe that's the beginning of true freedom, not the kind that breaks ties, but the kind that purifies them until they become sacred. Now that you've begun to see the invisible foundations of ethical respect and responsible presence, let's go deeper. How do you live these principles when the other brings challenge, tension, or emotional conflict? Imagine standing at a fork in the road. To the left, the shortcut of avoidance, evasive silence, omissions, pretending, all in the name of fragile peace. To the right, the path of full presence, vulnerable dialogue, honest listening, clear boundaries, all in the name of integrity. Confucius teaches that the second path demands moral courage. He rarely speaks of conflict as duality, but he understood that ethical rights exist to pacify both inner and outer turmoil. You've lived this before. When you avoid confrontation, the weight increases. When you choose dialogue with integrity, a deep sense of relief appears. The moral antithesis is clear. Avoidance strengthens the cycle of pain. Facing relationships with ethics aligns you with the Tao of activated calm. Sounds like a paradox? Yes, and that's the beauty of ancestral wisdom. Dynamic balance at the center of polarities. Just as yin needs yang to exist, you need that contrast to awaken the depth of your character. The philosophical analogy? A river. If it flows gently, you float. If it turns into rapids, you anchor or dive into cross with presence. Now visualize a Confucian parable. One day, a disciple complained about a friend speaking ill of him behind his back. Confucius replied, "Before seeking justice, cultivate your virtue." The disciple was confused, but understood. Sometimes, it's not your reaction that transforms the situation, it's inner refinement. Virtue shines so brightly that the external noise dissolves. That is reflective repetition at work. Seeing inwardly, acting outwardly, not with force but with coherence. You might ask, but how do I apply this today? On WhatsApp, at work meetings, and intimacy? Here comes active ethical presence. If someone snaps harsh words, wait for the silence that listens before responding. If your boundaries are violated, create space through ethical clarity, not with aggression, but compassionate firmness. If a relationship requires compromise, offer it without abandoning yourself. Each small conscious action becomes a virtuous cycle. Each emotional path transforms into fertile ground for authentic relationships. Use bamboo again as metaphor. Strong, flexible, reverent to the wind, yet deeply rooted. In your modern relationships, you can live this way, sensitive, firm, and whole. This is the circular practice of the ethical journey, not a single event, but a daily rotation of choices reaffirming who you truly want to be. Then you realize something even more subtle. Ethics isn't limited to spoken words or visible actions. It lives in the space between messages, in the tone you choose, in the silence that allows the other to hear themselves, in the pause before defending yourself. Everything communicates. Everything builds or breaks. Asterisk, asterisk. Confucius didn't say you need to be right. He said you need to be whole. And being whole means being transparent with what you feel without losing awareness of how you express it. It's possible to express frustration without wounding, to show dissatisfaction without humiliating, to disagree without dehumanizing. That's the virtue of compassionate clarity, the meeting point between the Tao of silence and the sword of truth. Not a sword that wounds, but one that cuts illusion from essence. You can feel when someone speaks truth without harshness. Those words enter, not by force, but by energetic coherence. Buddhist philosophy adds something vital. The source of suffering in relationships often lies in the attachment to control. Expecting the other to respond exactly how you would, wanting people to feel, think, react as you would. But they are not you. They are unique universes filled with invisible pain and maps. Liberation begins when you honor this. When you love someone for who they are, not for who you wish they were. When you let go of control and access the quiet power of deep acceptance. That's not resignation. That's wisdom. Picture a couple in conflict. One wants to be heard. The other shuts down in fear. Both are protecting themselves. Both are screaming inside. But something changes when one of them breathes, looks the other in the eyes, and says, I don't want to win. I want to understand. That's when transformation begins. Reflective repetition is born in that moment. Every time you choose listening, even in fear, you realign your life's flow. Each microethical decision is a seed planted in the invisible field of the Tao. As the Tao Te Ching says, a giant tree grows from a tiny sprout. The journey of 1,000 steps begins with a single one. And what greater first step than seeing the other as a sacred extension of yourself? There's a name for that in Taoist tradition, Wu Wei, effortless action. It's not passivity. It's deep presence. It's moving with the current, without forcing, without retreating. When you apply Wu Wei in relationships, you realize that you often don't need to insist, push, or yell. You only need to be so coherent and present that the other feels truly seen. In that space, there is no longer I and other. There is a field, a shared space, and within it, the rarest form of respect arises. The kind that doesn't need effort because it's already there. But it won't always be like that. Not every relationship transforms. And then you'll need the courage to let go. Because staying where there's no respect is abandoning yourself for an illusion. And there is no greater ethics than protecting your own essence. You don't walk away out of pride. You step back in reverence for your own energy. Even this, Confucius would understand. Because the true relational path isn't about staying at any cost. It's about staying where growth is mutual, where virtue finds reflection, where silence is not empty, but full of presence. And in that space, everything blooms. Even what once seemed lost, even what once seemed impossible to restore. Now you might be wondering, but what if there's no longer any exchange? What if the shared ground feels barren? What if love or friendship have been replaced by weariness, repeated wounds, and irreconcilable disconnection? This is where philosophy becomes more than reflection. It becomes blade and balm. Because Confucius never promised that virtue would solve every conflict. He promised that it would protect your integrity, even amidst chaos. Ethics, then, is not a guarantee of harmony, but a commitment to not losing yourself. Buddhism teaches, suffering is born from resistance to what is, and sometimes what is the end. Endings are disguised thresholds, portals of reconfiguration. Some relationships form us, others deform us, and some transform us precisely in the moment they leave. You don't need to keep something alive just because it once began. Nature teaches us. A flower does not force its bud to stay closed. When the time is right, it opens. And when it's no longer time, it falls. Even in falling, it never loses the dignity of the cycle it completed. This is where the archetype of the silent master appears. One who knows when to act, but also when to let go. Shintoism speaks of kami, natural spirits that inhabit all things. And when we connect with the essence of something, a tree, a friendship, a love, we feel when that spirit begins to withdraw. Respect, then, is in not holding back what needs to flow. But here's something even deeper. You can honor someone, even if you must let them go. You can maintain hard ethics, even when paths diverge. This is the emotional maturity few ever reach. To love without possessing, to release without punishing, to move on without wishing the other would stay small to fit your story. And now you see how everything returns. The structure is circular, not linear. What began with Li, the rituals of coexistence, returns now as Wu Wei, the art of allowing the natural without forced interference. Notice how reflective repetition reappears. Everything you've lived becomes a mirror of what you now understand. You've returned to the starting point, but you are not the same. That is expansion. That is the circle of consciousness. And in this moment, perhaps you can even look at your past mistakes with new eyes. Not as failures, but as fragments of a greater learning. You didn't fail in loving, trusting, or trying. You were simply learning how to align virtue with truth. And that is rare. That is noble. That is Confucian. Now look at your most important relationships. Friends, family, partners. Ask yourself silently, is there presence where there should be more listening? Is there noise where there could be contemplation? Is there a self dissolving just to fit inside another? If so, perhaps it's time to renew your pact with your essence. Time to reclaim the ethics of connection, not as obligation, but as an art form. The art of relating as if every soul were a temple, and every word, incense lit before the invisible. Asterisk, asterisk. And maybe what scares us most isn't loneliness, but real intimacy. Because to practice Confucian ethics in relationships, you have to take off the masks. And few are ready for that. Most prefer repeating roles, living through appearances, pretending everything is fine, while the silence screams. But Confucius never spoke about perfection. He spoke about intention, not about personas, but about people who become more human by embracing vulnerability. Here, a subtle convergence with Buddhism emerges. Compassion is born when you stop expecting perfection from others. When you recognize that behind every harsh word, there's unresolved pain. That everyone is doing the best they can to protect themselves. The practice of benevolence begins with you. How do you treat yourself during hard times? With care or criticism? With presence or judgment? Because how you handle your own failure is exactly how you'll respond to someone else's. That's why real ethics begins in the invisible, in what you think when no one is watching, in what you feel when there's nothing to hide, in what you cultivate internally before offering it outwardly. And so, the antithesis emerges. You don't need to understand to accept. Don't need to agree to respect. Don't need to control to be at peace. The harmony Confucius speaks of is not forced agreement. It is coexistence. The Tao reminds us, water overcomes rock not by force, but by persistence. So it is with mature love. It doesn't invade, doesn't scream, doesn't demand. It remains silent and strong until the other recognizes the safety in your presence. And when there's no return, when the other cannot or will not walk with you, the answer is not anger. It is reverence for what was possible, for how much was tried, for the courage to continue, even when the heart still wants to stay. This is where all spiritual traditions meet. When the self becomes a channel, not the center. When you stop trying to win and start trying to serve. When you stop imposing and start understanding. When you stop needing to be right and start leaving things better than you found them. Then you begin to transform everything around you without saying a word, because your energy speaks, your gaze speaks, your calm speaks. And ethics, this living, vibrant, compassionate ethics, begins to circulate like a subtle perfume, invisible but present, discreet but unforgettable. Asterisk, asterisk. This is the legacy of Confucius, translated into now. And if you felt something while reading all this, it's because this ancient teaching had been asleep inside you all along. Now it has awakened, but make no mistake, hearing is not understanding. Knowing is not living. Asterisk, asterisk. Wisdom does not settle in thought, but in the silent repetition of everyday gestures. And that's why Confucius virtues are demanding, because they require practice in the most sacred and most challenging terrain of all, human interaction. Want to know if someone is wise? Observe how they treat their parents, how they treat employees, how they treat those who can offer them nothing. Wisdom isn't measured by words on a stage, but by the posture held in the face of someone else's impatience. Unfair criticism, unexpected delay, asterisk, asterisk. That's where the true disciple of the Tao is revealed. And then you understand. The path of respect is not passive. It requires strength, not the strength of domination, but the strength of ego renunciation. Because the ego wants to win, the soul wants to understand. At this point, Confucius' teachings align deeply with Taoism. Living in harmony doesn't mean never confronting. It means knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to let life teach by itself. Knowing that often the most powerful act of love is allowing the other to face the consequences of their own choices. And you, are you ready for that? Ready to love without clinging? To teach without imposing? To guide without carrying? Because that's the ethics of the wise. An ethics that flows like a river but doesn't bend before injustice. That embraces but doesn't dissolve itself. That understands another's mistake without becoming complicit in it. Think about the relationships you have today. How many are sustained by truth? How many by habit? By fear? By control? There's no judgment here, only invitation. An invitation to look honestly and with tenderness. Because only then can you choose again. And only those who choose again, consciously, begin to walk the true middle path. What the Buddha called Majjhima Padapada. Between attachment and indifference, there is lucid love. Between dominance and submission, there is mutual respect. Between noise and silence, there is listening. And in that subtle space, where few dare to remain, are born the relationships that heal instead of harm. Are you willing to remain there? It's uncomfortable at first. It demands a new inner posture. But over time, that presence becomes natural, like bamboo that, though whipped by the wind, never breaks. It bends. It returns. It endures. That's the secret to endure. Not because it's easy, but because you chose not to abandon what is sacred. And any relationship born from respect becomes a temple, a place where both can grow, err, and learn together. And now, something in you has already shifted. Can you feel it? Change doesn't arrive with noise. It enters like the morning breeze, light, almost imperceptible, but transformative. When you begin looking at others, not through the lens of expectation, but through the eyes of compassionate curiosity, asterisk, asterisk, the relationship expands. It's no longer about how the other should be. It becomes about who they really are and whether you're willing to meet them beyond what your ego wants. And ironically, it's in this surrender that you find your own reflection. Because no one crosses your path by accident. Each person, in their beauty or chaos, brings a subtle mirror of what still needs to be seen inside you. That is the essence of Eastern wisdom. There is no separation between self and world. In Shintoism, the kami, spirits, live in all things. In the stone, in the flower, in another's gaze. Every encounter is sacred. Every gesture, a rite. Every word, an echo that reverberates beyond what can be seen. That's why speaking with respect is just as important as speaking the truth. Because form shapes content. And often, what wounds is not what was said, but how it was said. Have you thought about that? How many times have you hurt someone while trying to help? How many times have you been hurt by someone who said they cared? Confucius taught that virtue is not just an intention, but in conduct. Because it's not enough to want to do good. You must know how to offer it. And that's an art requiring sensitivity, attention, presence. Words can heal, but they can also trap. A gesture can liberate or humiliate. That's why the path of wisdom is so demanding, because it calls for consciousness in every act, even the simplest ones. It's easy to be kind to those who admire you. The challenge is maintaining respect for those who challenge you. It's easy to be ethical when things are calm. The true test is how you act when you feel attacked, devalued, betrayed. And it's not about repressing your emotions. It's about learning to express them without destroying the other in the process. Transforming anger into clarity, fear into firmness, pain into compassion. Think that's weakness? Confucius thought the opposite. To him, the truly strong are those who conquer themselves, not those who dominate others, but those who master their impulses, not those who stay silent, but those who choose words like seeds, knowing each will take root in some soil and bear fruit of peace or conflict. This is the kind of ethics that transforms, not the kind that moralizes, but the kind that humanizes. And perhaps at this very moment, something is reorganizing inside you. A new, quiet understanding of what it really means to be in a conscious relationship. With the other, yes, but first with yourself, because that's where it all begins, in a relationship you have with yourself. Have you ever noticed what you say to yourself in moments of silence? Have you heard the subtle judgments you launch at your own soul when you make a mistake, when you fall short, when you feel too much? The truth is, no one wounds others more than they already wound themselves inside. And no one respects another beyond the level of respect they have for themselves. That's why Confucius said, to govern a state, begin by ordering your household. To order your household, begin by mastering your heart. But who wants to govern the heart these days? We seek to control what's outside, while we lose ourselves inside. We try to change others, manipulate situations, predict outcomes, all to avoid facing the chaos within. But chaos is not the enemy. It is the raw material of creation. In Buddhism, this is taught through samsara, the cycle of birth and death, pain and rebirth. Every relationship goes through this. Every evolving soul must die to its illusions to be reborn in truth. And truth is simple, so simple that it scares us. Because truth doesn't promise guarantees. It only offers a path of presence, of acceptance, of openness. Do you accept others as they are? Or do you try to mold them to your inner ideals? Do you listen to understand? Or do you wait for your turn to speak? Do you love to free or to possess? These questions have no single answer. They ask for silence, observation, courage, the courage to admit that we still love with attachment, still listen in haste, still demand more than we give, not to feel guilty, but to begin, because recognizing where you are is the first step toward walking with awareness. And then respect ceases to be a concept and becomes practice. Love ceases to be desire and becomes offering. Ethics ceases to be a rule and becomes coherence. You begin to sense when a word is too much, when a look is enough, when silence holds more wisdom than 1,000 pieces of advice, and you begin to respect the other's time, their space, their pain, without trying to fix, without trying to heal, just being there, present, available, human. And that, my friend, is revolution. A quiet revolution, but a deep one. A revolution that begins in you and ripples outward like the soft sound of a bell touching morning air. Then you realize you no longer need to shout to be heard. You don't need to win to be respected. You don't need to be right to be at peace. You discover that the wisest person isn't the one who accumulates words, but the one who knows when to be silent. That the strongest isn't the one who sets the most limits, but the one who honors their own with dignity. That is Confucian wisdom, not as a dead doctrine, but as living breath, pulsing in every choice, every subtle gesture you offer the world. Is the Tao of Lao Tzu whispering. To force is to meet resistance. To flow is to find harmony. To yield may be the greatest form of strength. Asterisk, asterisk. And so, without even realizing it, you begin transforming everything around you. Without fanfare, without seeking applause, just being. Because when you align with this living ethics, not found in books, but in the in-between moments of presence, life begins to respond differently. People approach you differently. Conversations deepen. Even conflict becomes a space for growth, not a battlefield for egos. You learn to see with the eyes of the soul, to hear what was never said, to understand what lies beyond logic, and to love with maturity, not as someone who needs, but as someone who overflows. And that's when wisdom becomes love, and love becomes the path. A path home, back to your essence, back to what you always knew, but had forgotten. Because truth isn't out there. It's in the center of your silence. It's in the moment you take a deep breath instead of reacting. When you see someone's pain and offer your hand, not your judgment. In the pause before your reply. In the hug you didn't withhold. In the forgiveness you didn't demand. That is the true relationship. The sacred meeting of two worlds choosing to respect each other, even when they don't fully understand each other. Even when everything inside screams for a reaction, but the soul chooses compassion. And maybe, just maybe, that's where happiness begins. Not in the absence of conflict, but in the presence of consciousness. Not in what you receive from others, but in who you become through them. After all, as Confucius once said, where there is respect, there is harmony. Where there is harmony, there is joy. Where there is joy, there is truth. And where there is truth, there is love.